Good evening. Thank you for being here, and let's get started. I welcome you to a panel discussion on the subject of freedom of speech. My name is Tanya Bilsbury, and I'm Secretary of the Atlantic Chapter of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. I'm a PhD candidate at St. Mary's, where I study career development, organizational development, and equity, inclusion, diversity, and accessibility in industrial organizational psychology. I'll be moderating the discussion today. SAF stands for the Defense of Intellectual Freedom and the Promotion of Standards of Excellence in Academic Administration. Civitas is a nonprofit organization that exists to promote and deepen understanding through the exchange of a wide range of political, economic, social, religious, cultural, and philosophical ideas concerning the principles and traditions of a free and ordered society. So these are both libertarian groups, and so we have a subculture that encourages and welcomes debate. Your questions are welcome, and if you don't agree with the panelists, then you are free to voice your dissent. Our panelists tonight are William Brooks, Stephen Perrott, and Mark Mercer. Bill has had a long career in public and private education. He spent many years teaching history, economics, and political science at Lower Canada College in Montreal, and was director of that school's pre-university program. Came to Nova Scotia in 2007 to serve as Director of Advancement for the Sacred Heart School of Halifax. Throughout the years, Bill has contributed to several Canadian and international publications and is currently an opinion columnist for the Epoch Times. Stephen Perrott is a professor of psychology at Mount St. Vincent University, where he's in his 32nd year of teaching. He's a clinical psychologist by training, and his primary research interest is the psychology of policing. And he has significant experience working with the police in development projects in the Gambia and the Philippines. He's a former career police officer and a volunteer firefighter. And his clinical work at Fenwick Wellness focuses on police officers, firefighters, serving members of the military, and military veterans. Mark Mercer has been teaching philosophy for 30 years, now at St. Mary's University. His interests in philosophy are wide. He writes mainly about whether anyone knows anything, about how our thoughts, desires, and emotions relate to our brains, and what education looks like to those who value intellectual and moral autonomy. And he's great fun to argue with. He's in his 8th and final year as president of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, and a collection of his articles on education has just been published in his book called In Praise of Dangerous Universities. And with that, I'll let you begin.
Thank you, Tanya. So you're in good company here with me tonight because I don't know very much.
None of us do, finally.
I won't speak much about Civitas because Tanya has just outlined the organization, but Civitas was founded about 25 years ago, and it does have a pretty explanatory website if you wanted to go to it. The membership is quite open, all philosophical stripes, really. We have, classical liberals, conservatives, neoconservatives, libertarians, even some social democrats, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. The panels that we do, we have one major conference at the beginning of the year, in the spring of the year, in May usually, and that's our premier event, annual event, but we try to team up with other organizations and hold these conferences around the country. So if you're open to civil conversations, go onto the website. You may be interested in becoming a member. We often operate under Chatham House rules, but that won't apply tonight because it's an open session, so if anyone wants to be too careful about what they're saying, be careful. The question for this evening, isn't free speech a human right? As an old debating coach, let's start with a few definitions. Human rights are generally rights regarded as belonging fundamentally to all persons, such as freedom from unlawful searches, prosecutions, imprisonment, torture, execution, etc. And freedom of speech specifically is generally regarded as the right to express information, ideas, and opinions free of political or cultural coercion and government restrictions. That generally includes freedom of the press and academic freedom, which will be addressed by my two academic friends on either side. A little bit of the history of the notion of freedom of speech. Throughout the modern era, and by that I really mean sort of, the age of reason and the Enlightenment era, we've generally recognized freedom of speech as an important human right because it advances learning and it's worth preserving. It serves an open society. There's been a lot of philosophical support for it. Everybody in this room will probably remember, Voltaire's famous declaration that I disapprove of what you say, but will defend to my death, the right for you to say it. Fast forward, and we came to many of you remember Salman Rushdie, who said, "What is freedom of expression without the freedom to offend? It ceases to exist." But that's Salman Rushdie just lost an eye because of that opinion, if you recall, about a month ago. So generally philosophically supported, but not always easy to pull off. There's a great deal of constitutional support and institutional support for the idea of free speech. There are formal guarantees of freedom of speech in the First Amendment to the American Constitution. In Canada, freedom of expression is protected as a fundamental freedom by Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Actually, we had those rights long before 1982, but we decided we'd write them down because our American friends had. The United Nations, that sort of sacred organization that governs so much of our politics, had a Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted in 1948 after World War II, which said everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. And so it came to be that even communist totalitarian regimes that were carved out of the West after World War II, like, for example, the German Democratic Republic, were also obliged to recognize the merits of free speech. One of the reasons we're talking about this tonight was because of a lecture that was given earlier this summer by Christina Bamy, who lived in the German Democratic Republic through her formative years. And I found it particularly interesting to speak to her about this for reasons that I think you'll see in a moment. Paragraph 27 of the Constitution of the GDR, written in 1968, granted every citizen the right to free speech and the freedom of the printed press, radio, and television. At the same time, however, the criminal code of the GDR listed, I won't try to say these in German, but, quote, subversive agitation and, quote, misuse of media for bourgeois ideology as punishable offenses. So you begin to see that the yin and the yang of free speech and restrictions on free speech begins early. We often look back on John Stuart Mill and the so-called no harm principle. You remember Mill was a British liberal, and he said the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. The pandemic and the vaccinations may remind you of some of the issues that came up over that kind of thinking. Mill also said, if all mankind minus one were of one opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. So, Mill was, unless there was a harm principle involved, Mill was an open free speech advocate. In the US and Canada, speech rights are also subject to so-called reasonable limitations. In the USA, A lot of you will recall the so-called clear and present danger doctrine. It comes from a 20th century Supreme Court decision. I'll just compete with the History Association over here for a moment and give you a little outline about that. In 1917, the U.S. Congress declared war on Germany. 2 months later, President Wilson signed into law a much-debated Espionage Act that, among other things, provided punishment for willfully obstructing the draft. Charles Schenck, who was General Secretary of the Socialist Party in Philadelphia, mailed the leaflet to men who were reported to have passed their draft board physicals. Schenck attacked the draft as an unconstitutional violation of the rights of free citizens and compared a conscript to a convict. He said the act deprived him of his liberty and the right to think and act as a free man. He said, "Long live the Constitution of the United States and assert your rights." Schenck was then arrested for violating the Espionage Act of 1917. But at the trial, the prosecution really wasn't able to produce evidence that the leaflets had successfully dissuaded anyone from joining the war effort. Those who testified stated they were not influenced by Schenck's mailings. Despite that claim, the leaflets, despite his claim that the leaflets were just an expression of his opinion, Schenck was convicted and sentenced to 6 months in prison. His case was appealed, and it eventually went to the Supreme Court. And it was Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes who upheld the verdict in the Supreme Court, saying that Schenck obviously, despite that no one had listened to him, Schenck obviously intended to obstruct the truth. And that brought about one of the most quoted lines in the annals of constitutional law, which Holmes intended to apply to circumstances when a nation's at war. Holmes said, "The character of every act depends upon the circumstances in which it's done. The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, causing a panic." I think a lot of you would recognize that statement. In Canada, during the 1970 October crisis, which I unfortunately remember, the War Measures Act was used to limit speech and political action by militant FLQ supporters. Many on the left at the time, including myself, and Quebec nationalists objected on the grounds of government overreach. So the left objected on the grounds of government overreach. One could argue that Pierre Elliott Trudeau's choice to use the War Measures Act was justified at that time. Perhaps there was a clear and present danger. Two men were kidnapped and one was murdered. Pierre Laporte was murdered. The British diplomat was finally released. Whether or not Justin Trudeau's use of the Emergency Powers Act against the Canadian Freedom Convoy and its supporters was justified is also up for open debate, or should be up for open debate. This time, Canadian progressives and liberals appear to be in favor of government overreach, however. So the tables sort of flipped in the political spectrum. So shutting down free speech always turns to identifying the difference between a real clear and present danger and a particular regime's defense of a conventional narrative and its desire to shut down the opposition. That's the constant yin and yang that we have. How are we doing?
Well, a couple minutes.
Couple minutes? I'll deal with hate speech maybe in the question period, but I'll leave you with this thought. We seem to be moving toward a period in which we're limiting speech and limiting expression more than we ever did. There's almost 4 steps that you can see developing. First, you permit debate, but only on certain terms. only on the regime's terms, only on the establishment media's terms. They set the questions, they set the issues, they tell you what's going to be argued, they tell you how many people are going to be in the room, but the debate is open. The second is a tendency to isolate dissent and ignore opposition. So you'll get things like big tech companies with, with algorithms that can, set trending news and that sort of thing. The third really targets and punishes opposition. In other words, you worry about your job, you worry about your tenure, you worry about that what you say may make it impossible for you to continue to work. And the fourth and most dramatic, and you can decide whether we've ever reached that at this point, is basically eradicating opposition, using law and police to possibly fine or imprison opponents of your free speech. And I think that's somewhere along that spectrum is perhaps where we are at this point. I'll end there and pass it on to Steve.
Well, thank you. Some of the parallels in my talk, even though mine's much more academic, are interesting because back in the 1970s, when I was a young police officer, some of the more conservative police officers would be disgruntled by those damn left-wingers crying about their free speech rights. So I grew up in an era, and I guess probably all three of us did, where free speech was something that was demanded by the political left. Somewhere when I wasn't paying attention, free speech became right-wing. It just blows me away. I'm not quite sure what happened. I do have some hypotheses, but it's very, very peculiar. And in the universities, Bill's talking about being suppressed by maybe the state. Maybe I shouldn't take it so literally, the state or the police. But in the universities, it's partially the state, but it's mostly the professoriate that is demanding censorship. And they've somehow been able to convince students that that's a good idea too, that censorship is in the pursuit of justice. Most of my knowledge is psychology of policing, which is kind of related to social psychology, and social psychology is probably the most jaded field in psychology. But that doesn't mean that all the disciplines are not jaded and polluted at this point. Social psychology just tends to be kind of easy picking to point out. So I'm not just shooting fish in a barrel, it's all the disciplines. Even the natural sciences are going down. The only reason the natural sciences aren't going down as quickly because not as much of their subject matter is open to contention by the critical social justice bunch. So the pressure to ask certain research questions and come up with certain prescribed answers didn't happen all at once. It happened over time, and I think it was initially part of the zeitgeist of the early 60s associated with the Kennedy-Johnson War on Poverty and then the civil rights movement. There was a real, and I support this effort, there was a real desire to fight against racial discrimination. And that remains a good goal, but it's only a good goal if your scholarship is not overtaken by your advocacy. If your scholarship remains true as best as you can, and if different points of view are able to prevail and battle it out, and what Mark tells me uses, and I've always thought this was the idea, but I never had the word for it, a culture of disputation, and that's how you get the best ideas coming to the surface. That's certainly not what we have now. So in social psychology, sometimes social science is said, sometimes medicine, we have a replication crisis. So many of the major experiments that were done can't be replicated. And so there is a crisis going on, and people are trying to figure out why these studies can't be replicated. The biggest reason, in my view, and this is kind of alluded to, but it's danced around for other explanations, is that people just wanted certain findings to be true to come and support their cause. And so the three examples I talk about here, that I'll mention here, are self-fulfilling prophecies, stereotype threat, and the most twisted of them all is the implicit association test. So self-fulfilling prophecies, most of the older people here remember when that research started coming out in 1968, Rosenthal and Jacobson. The tremendous power that teachers had over students could actually shape their IQ scores. Very powerful research, very important implications, and very much overstated in the original instance. People are not as susceptible to self-fulfilling prophecies as the social psychologists of the late 60s and early 70s wanted you to believe. Following self-fulfilling prophecy, we had stereotype threat. That was a notion, advanced concept developed by Claude Steele, brother of the famous conservative Shelby Steele. I understand the two brothers don't speak to each other. Claude, last I heard, was the vice president and provost at UCLA. I'm not sure if he's still there or not. It's a variant on self-fulfilling prophecy, but in this case, it made it a little more palatable, I suppose, for the majority group because minority group members were doing it to themselves. You make a stereotype salient, and minority group members will do themselves in. That's the basis of stereotype threat. Much like self-fulfilling prophecies, way overblown, and the research full of methodological problems. But nobody would dare to challenge these research findings. And finally, the implicit association test, which has created an industry about unconscious racism. That's probably the most bogus of the three I've mentioned. At best, the implicit association test measures familiarity bias. But that doesn't stop big companies from using it week after week after week in their seminars and their group gatherings to show people how they are unconsciously biased and racial prejudice. And it's just not true. As we move further and further away from really, really overt prejudice, it became important, I think, for the social justice crowd to strain further and further to find evidence to support their hypotheses. And they needed at this point to keep those researchers that had pesky empirical findings that didn't go with the narrative, they needed to suppress them. So two things happened. The rise of critical theory, and critical theorists and researchers don't perceive there to be any need for evidence. They make wild claims, and they actually quite proud that they don't provide any evidence to support those claims. On the other hand, there's been great efforts to shut down empirical research that have the real numbers. So in my own area of policing, Roland Fryer, who is an economist at Harvard University, a black man who studied police shootings, was very, very convinced he was going to find evidence of anti-black racism. As it turns out, he didn't find any. He found actually a tendency in the other direction. And there were different results, but his findings certainly challenged the idea that American police officers were shooting down young black men in the streets. It just wasn't true. If you controlled for all the variables, there was no anti-black bias. Well, Roland Fryer has been fried because of that. He's been basically called an Uncle Tom, a traitor to his race, and he is suspended now on the basis of sexual harassment charges. Now, there's some debate about whether this is true or not. Glenn Laurie, if you know Glenn Laurie from Brown University, thinks that this is his punishment for coming up with this unpalatable finding. Another example of the cause of dissent was a more recent study in 2020 where the evidence suggested that there was no evidence that white police officers were any more likely to shoot people of color than officers who were minority group members. In fact, again, the evidence went the other way a little bit. One of the statements in that particular study was, quote, "Hiring more diverse officers may not reduce racial disparities in these incidents." Well, that's an inconvenient finding. That got through referees and got published. The you-know-what hit the fan. And these researchers themselves asked to have their paper retracted because they said the right-wing media is making hay out of it and we don't want to contribute to that. Never mind that what they reported was true. They actually retracted their own paper. Now, these well-published cases tend to overshadow, might make you think that these are one-offs. But the really big problem is that nobodies like me are silenced every day because we learn that if we want to get something published or if we want to get research funding, we have to ask an allowable question and we have to signal that the answer we're going to find after we collect the data is going to be consistent with that question. Now, I know this in a couple of ways. I had a paper bounce around to different journals looking at recruitment of minority members and women to police forces. Had it accepted in one journal, almost accepted, and then got a new reviewer and basically suggested I was a bigot. Then I also had it accepted clearly with no qualifications by the Canadian Journal of Social Policy Review, and then had a refusal to publish it ultimately. As far as I can tell, my sins there were to say that maybe one of the reasons why we can't get women up above 22, 23% in police forces is because women choose not to do that. Well-documented differences in interests. And I also had the audacity to report on some of these things about racial prejudice in the police, like the Fryer study. That paper has now been published. It took 7 years. If I was a young professor looking for tenure, I couldn't stand that. I'd be out of work. I couldn't do that. I couldn't manage that fight. The other problem I had was trying to get $7,500 from the research committee at my own university. Now, bear in mind that a few years before I asked for the $7,500, I was given $1.5 million, the biggest grant in the history of the university, to run a community policing project in West Africa. However, this time, they started coming back with rejection after rejection, and I went through appeal after appeal. What turned out was, and I didn't realize this, I wasn't trying to be provocative, I was wanting to ask questions about people's attitudes about rape culture. I was interested in how polarized the views were. And I thought if I asked a lot of people, I would find that people had views spreading out over a spectrum. It turns out, I'm fully convinced, I was not allowed to ask that question because the narrative was already established. There's no debating it. Anything I would have found would have hurt that narrative. And so I got all kinds of baloney reasons. I got threatened by the vice president with disciplinary action because I fought back. And I was even told by the director of research at the university that maybe I could go and take a workshop on how to write grants. No, I wasn't insulted, not a bit. So I fought that because I didn't think they could do it. I didn't think they could, they were obviously censoring me. The evidence was clear, and I didn't think they could get away with it. I was wrong. Now, across town, in another university, there was a professor doing research on rape culture and was getting all kinds of funding and publishing all kinds of stuff, but I think the direction of her research was more palatable to the establishment. So I suspect I'm getting close to being out of time. So I want to reiterate this. This is not just a problem for psychology. This is a problem for all the disciplines. And I really am of the view today that in any of a number of areas that involve sex, gender, race, any of these things, if you find a paper, a published paper, it's better, you'll be more accurate if you disbelieve what's said in it than if you believe. And that problem's been made even worse now that young scholars are being made on to sign away their fealty to diversity, inclusion, and equity. I mean, you talk about politicizing the research field. And of course, what happens is that these young people, you act in this way enough times, it becomes normalized. So the question I have is, and this shouldn't be about political points of view, this should be about research and the scholarly enterprise. If scholars cannot conduct the research they want, ask the questions they want, and pay attention to the data they have. If scholars are not prepared to do that, one has to ask, why do we have universities? Because surely this culture of disputation is the only thing unique that universities offer society. So if we breach that contract with society, why would society go on to continue to support this very narrow range of views that's getting, in many ways, very close to propaganda? And if I'm apprehensive as a almost 66-year-old man, half-time retired, to talk about this to you, what do you think the chances are of a 29 or 30 or 35-year-old young scholar prepared to say that the emperor has no clothes? Okay. So I'll leave you with that. What purpose the university? Thank you.
I was to talk about academic freedom and freedom of expression on campus, and a bit about the idea of a culture of disputation. So I hope I'm not going to repeat too much of what Steve has said. I don't think there's ever been a time when universities have been, when there's been a golden age of universities as places of intellectual inquiry. Every generation there have been cases where professors or students have been persecuted for trying to investigate such a topic or saying something about it that goes against prescribed doctrine. But yet, I do think there are better and worse times. The period from, I don't know, the late 60s into the 90s might have been the best of times, even though there are many cases where academic freedom was violated and freedom of expression on campus was curtailed. But I think things are getting worse now, and so I wonder why. I want to offer an hypothesis, see how that goes. First of all, why a culture of disputation? Who would want to live in a culture of disputation? Well, we're moving away from the university as a culture of disputation. Different cultures are coming in, cultures of affirmation, cultures of recognition, cultures of celebration are beginning to elbow aside the culture of disputation that's at the core of universities, at least at their best. University people engage in disputation for two reasons. One is that through criticism of their ideas, through criticizing other people's ideas, we come up with better ideas. The earliest traditions among the Greeks, Thales says everything is made of water. Thales says the earth rests on water and it's water all the way down. And he says to his pupil, Anaximander, this is my explanation for these natural phenomena. Now you go away, criticize my explanations, come up with something better. Anaximander goes away and says, wait a second, everything can't be made of water. If everything was made of water, then everything would be cold and wet. But there's also hot and dry. And so he posits there being the unbounded, right? The limitless. So he has this great conceptual abstraction. He thinks of what Thales said about the land resting on water, water going all the way down. He says, that can't be right. Infinitely deep water. Here's my idea. The earth hangs unsuspended in space. Wow. The earth hangs unsuspended in space. It doesn't fall. Why? Because there's nowhere for it to fall. Falling has to do with surfaces. How did Anaximander come up with these brilliant ideas? Not just by being a brilliant man, but by taking the ideas around him, other people's ideas, Thales' ideas particularly, and subjecting them to criticism, and through subjecting them to criticism, discovering better ideas. Ideas that preserve the good in the previous explanation, but expand and overcome problems. So one of the reasons that we would want a culture of disputation, a culture where people are openly critical of other people's ideas, any aspect of other people's thought, is that it helps us to improve, to find the errors and come up with better explanations, deeper, richer, better explanations. Now, this appeals, though, only to a certain sort of person. It's not a majority project. Who does it appeal to? Well, it appeals to people who value intellectual and moral autonomy. Intellectual autonomy, the ability and willingness to think for oneself. Moral autonomy, the ability and willingness to value for oneself, rather than take one's thoughts, ideas, theories from others. And why would one take them from others? Well, because you'd be ostracized if you don't. You have a desire to fit in. You have a desire not to be kicked out. Why would you want to be the one who affirms your own values rather than passively accept the values of others? Because you're the sort of person who thinks it's not only important to value soundly, but to value for your own reasons. You hope that you're valuing soundly for your own reasons, but you would rather value unsoundly for your own reasons than value soundly as a result of social and psychological pressures. So it's a particular sort of person who values intellectual and moral autonomy, wants to investigate the world, and wants to do so in community, wants to do so alongside others. Wants to do so alongside others so that he or she can listen to the criticism of others, but also just because it's more fun to engage with others in the same project, even if their views are opposed to yours. Now, from this we get the concept of respect that used to be not prevalent at universities, but at any rate the prevalent ideology of the universities. The universities are human institutions, and so they go wrong in all sorts of ways. But a university would be embarrassed, right, if it was caught treating people disrespectfully, that is, manipulating, lying, cheating, manipulating them against their moral and intellectual autonomy. But now the concept of respect is shifting. The concept of what it is to respect someone, central to the ideology of the university, central to the idea of the university, was that we we respect each other's moral and intellectual autonomy when we refrain from using them as means to our own ends. That is, when we refrain from manipulating them, from lying to them, from failing to be candid with them about our views. But the concept of respect is now shifting, and what we're to respect now at the university, and according to university doctrines, according to university documents, university policies promulgated by university senates and administrators, the object of respect now is identities and emotions, identities and feelings, and that to treat someone with disrespect is to hold some aspect of their identity up for critical examination. Why? Because, well, that would make the other feel like something the cat dragged in. And maybe it would, but in a culture of disputation, a culture where respect is directed toward intellectual and moral autonomy, that's the price you pay, sometimes feeling like something the cat dragged in, when an idea that matters to you, that's deeply matters to you, as part of your identity, is publicly criticized and perhaps found to be wanting by some people. But respect now, instead of candor, and we treat people we respect people's moral and intellectual autonomy when we're candid with them, but being candid with people might cause them emotional or other sorts of psychic pain. So we dissemble. So we're not candid anymore, and that counts as respect. So I think that's the sort of my analysis of what's happening with the shift in culture at universities, the shift in culture that's allowing senates and faculty unions, faculty associations, and the rest to come down on the side of strictures, restrictions, and the like, out of a concern for respect. It's a concern for respect, but it's a concern not for the respect of the intellectual and moral autonomy of the people at the university, but rather for the various identities, cultures, and emotions of the people within the university. Good. Here we are. Questions?
Thank you, gentlemen. Are there any questions or comments from the floor?
I have a question. It was a pepper grinder there. I agree with 99% of what's been said. My question is, what do we do about it? Because you're talking about within the university, but it going much further than that. A friend of mine who I hoped would be here tonight was telling me the other day that he was in the car with his grandson, who was 8, and somebody driving did something foolish. And my friend said, "Stupid idiot." And his 8-year-old son pulled him up and said, "You can't say that. You can't say people are stupid. You can't say, people are idiots." This is 8 years old. This is what he's being taught in school. So that's where it's starting. And then it's just continuing through. And it's this whole wokeism thing. What do we do about it? People are afraid now to say things. So simple things that you might a few years ago have said in normal conversation. Now they're afraid to say it because you'll have a mob outside your door, or if you're at school or at work or something, as you said, you may lose your job. What is your answer? Where do we start? I mean, you're at the top of the tree, but it's starting way down in the roots of our education system, and it needs to be addressed at that level.
Yeah, I feel your pain, as Bill Clinton once said. During the pandemic, we moved back to Montreal to be closer to our daughter and granddaughter, and ended up homeschooling our granddaughter in 2nd grade. And, our granddaughter is a perfectly normal kid, and her mother, went to King's Foundation program here and got the pink shower all the way through. And somehow, in the course of one lesson, something came up and about a president of the United States, and she said, "We don't like Donald Trump." And I said, "Really, Owen? Who's Donald Trump?" And she said, "Well, we don't like him." And I said, "Do you know him?" And I said, "You know." And I said, "Well, how the heck would you like people walking around the class saying they don't like Owen, and if they don't even know you?" And she sort of stopped and thought about that one a little bit. It does start at a very young age, and I think really, it's a cultural thing that you have to begin to start challenging assumptions. It's at every level and through every family and through every encounter. When kids simply repeat the conventional wisdom or the accepted narrative, ordinary people have to challenge it. I mean, truckers are challenging things more than university professors now. Yeah.
Contrary to my friend Mark, who is eternally optimistic about these things, I don't know how you challenge it. I know how you would have challenged it 15 years ago. A bunch of professors would have stood up and said, this authoritarianism has got nothing to do with social justice, and we're not going to have it. That's all that had to happen about 15 years ago. But university professors are gutless. And now, to speak up, you're likely to get picked off. And you're right, because when this started, I said, well, this is bad, but it's in the ivory tower. It's behind, it's locked up in the tower. But as you say, it's spread throughout society now. So I'm very pessimistic. I don't know what to do to fix it. And I'm half-time retired. I mean, if I get fired at this point, I won't be happy. And I don't anticipate getting fired because I'm not going to say anything much wilder than I'm saying here tonight. But I'm not feeling the loving feeling on campus anymore either. Maybe Mark has a different view of what we could do.
Where'd you get this idea that I'm optimistic? I'm not optimistic about this. I'm quite pessimistic because it's a very large general cultural shift. And I don't know how cultural shifts occur, and I don't know what one can do to stop them. What I do in my own practice, I'm trying to do two things. One, I'm trying to articulate what it is to encounter the world, to try to investigate the world as a morally and intellectually autonomous person, right? Articulate that, let other people see, try it on, see what they might think. So on the one hand, it's trying to preserve the ideas of a particular way of life. On the other hand, to try to create small communities within organizations like universities where people can live in disputation, where they're not afraid of savagely criticizing the person next to them, because the person next to them, this is the way they want to live as well. But I don't think these are ways of changing a culture, but they're ways at least of preserving what a culture is like in case there's a larger change and people won't have to rediscover it all by themselves or recreate it all by themselves.
Thank you. We have another question.
Sort of two parts. One is on words being redefined. So fascism is now redefined as anti-fascism, and violence is redefined as, from you hurt my feelings. It's woke for you hurt my feelings is now violence. And is it authoritarian to then demand that the definitions hold?
It's authoritarian to demand anything. We can
So should we allow this free flow of definition of words?
We should criticize, engage the ideas, engage the practices critically. I'm not so worried about meaning shift because then you can say, well, I'm using the word to mean whatever, or say something like, well, if hurting feelings is violence, then not all violence is wrongful violence. Or not all violence is to be is to draw the attention of the police or the other authorities. It's so much easier to keep terms when they're serving you well. But if the meanings are changing, then the implications of those words must be changing as well, and so you can point that out. at universities, people will sometimes talk about, well, if you say that or say it that way or say it in those terms, you're harming these people. And you might just say, well, yes, that's right, but it's not wrongful harming. Why is it not wrongful? Because they've consented to be members of a community of disputation, right? And this is how we live. Now, one of the problems, of course, is introducing students to this way of life, and if professors aren't doing that, there they are in their third year, and they don't know yet what it is to act as an academic, what it is to engage critically with people's ideas and people's practices. But as professors, those of us who want the university to continue its tradition of disputation and criticism, one of our tasks is to bring our students into that sphere, into that way of life. If only for the 4 years that they're there. If they don't like it, graduate and go do something else. But you don't know what it's like to live as an intellectual unless you've been given the opportunity to do so. And so one of the things is to try to help our students to live that life just to see how it is. For many of them, it's great, it's wonderful, and they want to continue. But they're there of their own free will. Here's what we're doing. What we're doing, if you like it a lot, then you might put up with a lot, right, in the way of emotional hurt.
Does that include safe spaces?
Well, there ought not be any safe spaces if it's a space safe from criticism.
Thank you.
Oh, and the words fool and chump don't have that association with intellectual disability, so I use them freely.
I'm going to introduce myself, if that's okay. My name is Michelle Lindsay, and I am with the People's Party of Canada. So, we get attacked often for the position that we have in terms of running for federal government to uphold the Constitution and Bill of Rights. And, one of the things that I noticed, Mark, was, when we want that autonomous, autonomous speech, that there seems to be a lot of this self-censorship that, we look at, we have to respect the person, so we have to self-censor what we really want to say. Mm-hmm. And, fear. Yeah, that's fear. And, instead of like the kids now, they don't want, they have this particular type of understanding, and they're going to be educated within that, that narrow path, and they do not want to be criticized at all. It's like a cognitive dissonance almost, that, hey, you're telling me something that I don't really understand. Mm-hmm. And so, there are so many things. I have been censored. I've been in debates where I've had MLA say she doesn't belong in our high school because her ideas don't align with ours, mm-hmm. Right? And so, yeah, I'm always, fighting to actually get the facts out and not be afraid. So we find we have to be bold, right, as Canadians. But the other thing is, I told someone when I was coming here, and I said, we're going to a symposium on free speech. You know what comes out? Oh, that's hate speech, right? Hate speech, because they think that we want to offend people rather than, giving the ideas in our heads, the ideas that we want to say that are actually fact, and not offend. We just want to say the truth.
To say I am offended. To say I am offended does not constitute an argument. It's, that's your problem.
It's a feeling.
Yeah, just because you're offended doesn't mean to say I can't say it.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about self-censorship, Bill or Steve?
Well, just to follow up on thank you, Michelle, on what Michelle was saying about censorship. in a sense, press freedom is really in trouble. I started writing for the Epoch Times maybe about just around 2019, 2020, and I was, happy to have the opportunity. There's not. There are some outlets that will publish opinions that would be regarded as more conservative or classical liberal or whatever the case may be. And I don't know if some of you remember this story, but shortly after Epoch Times founded a Canadian division, they distributed some papers to various neighborhoods in a typical. It was just really a typical promotional sort of thing, a drop of papers here, and this would be the offer. Well, the CBC just found 2 or 3 people who totally thought that they were traumatized by this, because somewhere in the 8 articles that appeared in that edition, someone had suggested that the COVID virus may have come from a lab in Wuhan. And that was, the CBC had a headline that was, Canadians reject racist opinions of this, Epoch Times, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, and they eventually had to, they never apologize, but they eventually had to acknowledge in writing that they were wrong in doing that. They spoke to 2 or 3 people who then passed for the entire country. And of course, today, it's regarded as very plausible that the virus came from a Wuhan lab. But that's the kind of shutting down of opinion. And I mean, you brought up politics. Andrew Breitbart was famous for saying, politics is downstream from culture. But I think that, our choice, we don't have many choices to change culture. The only way that the state and the regime and, controls the schools, the universities, as these 2 gentlemen have said, all of the formative institutions are controlled through the state. And basically independent schools go right along with it because they need their grants and that sort of thing. So politics may be the only way of beginning to make some changes.
But do we ever see a politician stand up and run for office on a policy that you're saying they should be? No, they're just going along with the status quo most times because all they want is votes. It's like the media, whether it's papers or radio or television or whatever.
I think the trouble is
all they want to do is sell papers or have an audience or get votes.
Well, I mean, that's really the way we're set up, isn't it? You need votes to get elected, but I don't believe that all politicians are the same.
Well, of course not.
And some are more courageous. Some will say, "Look, I know I'm not going to win in the near future, but I'm going to tell the truth anyway." And sometimes there are breakthroughs.
Just one more thing on self-censorship. There's the possibility of not getting tenure, not getting promoted, not keeping your job, all those things. But I think that you can't underestimate the self-censorship that comes from feeling socially ostracized.
And we're living in a culture of fear.
Yes, and now you could say that, I'm not going to put up with that, I'm going to speak my mind, but the reality is that, there's very few people in HRM that I can find a sense of community about with this. I mean, I was very lucky. I was a year in Australia, and I happened to find Mercer across the seas. There's lots of people at the Mount that agree with me, but nobody else that will raise their voice. And there's getting to be fewer and fewer that agree with me because they're being filtered at the beginning now to show their bona fides. So this culture of I'll give you a little example. It's kind of silly, and I shouldn't care so much, but I happened to be silly enough the other night to look at Rate My Professors. And I saw my latest rating, and they're all over the place, these ratings can be. But the latest rating was that I'd used a slur in the classroom. So I said, used a slur? And, you know, that, I'm not gonna write to Rate My Professor, but it doesn't feel good. I mean, I don't want to be called a racist. I don't want to be, it doesn't matter that it's not true. I'd rather avoid that, right? So, talked to some students today who were in the class and who were quite, seemed to be favorably predisposed to me, and it was what I thought it was. I was describing the change in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and saying that the category for intellectual deficiency was, before 2013, was still being called mental retardation. This is what we know as the use versus mention distinction. And that's indeed what got me in trouble, because I explained to the students that all the way to 2013, we were still using this word. That was my slur. And I probably will be very careful for the rest of the course.
I've been thinking about the two grandfathers, one to my left, one in front of me, who had stories about their grandchildren. And while I'm going to say something critical about both the grandfathers' attitude, I have to admit that if I were in this situation, I might not have been able to practice what I'm going to preach. Because practicing something on the spot quickly is hard. But with a bit of relaxed thinking, if my grandson said to me, so-and-so is a stupid idiot, I'll say, oh, that's interesting. Why do you say that? Or why do you not say that? What's wrong with saying you're a stupid idiot? In other words, engage in some kind of dialogue with that child, or that grandson or granddaughter, to treat them with the respect that Mark said we have to give other people for their intellectual and moral autonomy. Likewise, if your granddaughter did not like Trump, you might have said to her, tell me a bit more. What do you know about Trump? Tell me about how you came to that conclusion. And maybe in that process, she would have realized that she has no good reason not to like Trump or to like Trump, whatever it was. But we need to kind of practice what we preach when we say, treat other people with respect means treat them as intellectual, morally autonomous people. So take their argument seriously and let them expand on that argument until they either see that they're wrong or they might convince you otherwise. Yeah. Maybe you're beginning to dislike Trump too, who knows?
I agree with you. I entirely agree with you. Now, you do get an inclination that a 7-year-old girl living in Montreal doesn't know a great deal about American politics. So what I tried to say was maybe you should know more about someone before you dislike them. And I thought that's about the only thing you can come up with at that point.
Just for the record, I don't have any grandchildren. These were a friend of mine. And it was the grandfather that said stupid idiot, not the child. It was the child that corrected it.
Yeah.
So, not quite the same.
I think someone made a comment about there aren't that many freedom people, but there's a whole community in Halifax and in HRM, just to be aware of that. And social media has a big impact on freedom of speech and ideas that we want to put out there. So one of the things that I found was when I wanted to speak about, the policies of the People's Party, there were people that were finding my personal businesses, and they were basically Googling me and then giving me 1 star. If they could give me 0 stars, they would. So there are a lot of people that have lots to lose in terms of businesses or credibility in the university system. And in terms of politicians, you have to have people that are going to fight for Canadians and put Canadians first. And there are people out there who will do that, and they don't care about self-preservation in their positions in government. They care about what is going to happen for their future generations. Thank you.
Oh, I thought you had a
No,
next person?
the-
Oh, well, I wanted to say something about self-censorship, about that before, and about self-censorship and what it means for the academic project. The self-censorship that's worrisome is when someone thinks they have a comment, a question, a gesture, whatever, that were they to make it, it would move the conversation ahead. That were they to crack this joke, it might introduce a little levity, break some tension, and that would move the discussion ahead. So the self-censorship that's worrisome from the point of view of the professors and the students in the class is that which gets in the way of our discussing deeply and fully whatever the matter at hand is. So my point then is just simply that self-censorship isn't only a problem from the point of view of the person who wants to say something but worries that he or she is going to be shamed and so refrains from doing so. It's also a loss to the academic project itself because it means that comments and criticisms, moves in the discussion that might be helpful to discussion from an academic point of view are not taken. So it's a detriment to the academic project as well as, I don't know, painful or worrisome from the point of view of the individual.
Thank you, Mark. We have another question.
All right, so I see a lot of discussion about free speech directly relating to social media, but where social media is largely run by private companies like Meta, Snapchat, TikTok, etc., to what extent do those private companies have rights to control what is and isn't censored on their media?
Well, I think I'm certainly no expert in the legal aspects of this, but I think what we're beginning to see with, you remember that the internet and social media was going to give everyone a voice and empower all of us, but now they seem to be throttling anyone outside of this sort of woke conventional wisdom. And there was a bill before the U.S. Senate recently in the States that was kind of an arrangement that would force the internet companies or the tech companies to feed back funding into the media. The grounds is always, of course, we got to protect our local media, and these giants are taking over, and papers are failing, and that kind of thing. But that bill was about to pass, but I believe it was Senator, who's the Texas senator?
Ted Cruz.
Yeah, Ted Cruz brought up an amendment that said, because the bill included a right to sort of negotiate other things with the media, which would be using algorithms to put some media out of the trend and other media in the trend and that sort of thing. So it was going to be a sort of a cozy relationship that they would negotiate, and it certainly wouldn't be, Breitbart News or others that would benefit by it. It would be CBS, NBC, CNN, et cetera, et cetera. We already have that law in Canada. And built into the, I think it passed several months ago, and built into the bill itself is not just a negotiating ability, it's the the tech companies have to assure that the media companies that they are supporting are so-called quality news, and not misinformation. So.
Are you saying this C11, is that?
Yeah, yeah.
Still in the Senate, though?
It's still in the Senate, yeah, but, the House of Commons passed it. Yeah, maybe, hopefully, yeah. But that's where we are with big media. So it's very difficult to trust that anything will change in that way in the near future. I mean, these guys, I wouldn't give up entirely. Cultural shifts somehow surprise us, and we wouldn't. I remember reading an article just recently about the Queen passing and sort of saying, so much has gone by us in one lifetime. Like when I was a young guy, I wouldn't have believed that sort of Western civilization could be falling to pieces in my lifetime. I think, even Rome took hundreds of years to decline. So, but I don't know. I sort of remain. I think it was Father John Newhouse who often said, he used to like to say, "I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful."
Thank you,
I
Bill.
wanted to say two things in response to your question. One is that you have a right to do something doesn't mean it's not ill-advised to exercise that right. So even if that right exists, there may still be reasons not to exercise it. What was the second? Somebody tell me quick. What was the second point I was going to make? I don't remember. Anyway,
Have another question. Alex.
it'll come to me.
Actually, can you please restate that again? I'm just trying to remember what you were trying to say, to be honest.
Oh, yes, I said, to what extent do the social media companies have a right to uphold free speech on their, or to what extent do they have an obligation?
Yeah, I should have addressed that, but I think, the argument, the libertarian argument would be they're a free company, they can do what they want, But if they're not acting freely and they're also acting, according to, to political influence, then the censorship has just been sort of farmed out to big tech.
I remember the second thing I was going to say. I don't understand why this didn't happen. It seems to me like a good idea, and it seems that there would have been people who would have jumped at this. But a private company establishing itself, providing a service to internet users, saying, we'll filter out the bad stuff for you. Here are our people, here, their qualifications, whatever, and we could have 5, 6, 7, whatever, different companies competing, and those of us who, would want not to be bombarded by everything, well, we'd be hiring an editor and see what that editor gives us, and maybe we don't like it, go to someone else. But anyway, I don't understand why that didn't occur. It seems, Taylor,
The basis of when the internet came out, the U.S. Congress passed Bill Section 230, and it differentiated between a publisher who is responsible for the editorial content and any slander that may be associated with it, and a platform. So not unlike a telephone network, where nobody's editorializing or censoring what's happening here.
yeah.
And they said, we want to get this internet thing up and running, and we want to encourage free speech, so we will treat it as a platform, not a publisher. And so by treating it as a platform, free for all.
Yeah, no, that's fine, but why not private publishers, editors, offering their services to the public?
Are you saying like a Facebook to be an editorial?
Well, everyone,
It would take tens of thousands of editors. It's
no. Here's a service that you as a Facebook user can subscribe to with regard to your Facebook account. They'll do a bit of editing for you so that you don't have to. You've got only so much time. Farm out some of it to others.
You addressed it actually very well, Mark, but I would say for the social media aspect, we as the consumer give them the power to do that. So I'm not going to place all of it on the social medias for they have to edit it out ourselves, because we see a lot of it in our culture, especially in my time as a 19-year-old boy. We do a lot of demanding of canceling and wanting these people to be edited out.
Did I see a hand back there somewhere? Oh, you're good?
Just an
You're good, yes.
The monarch is the only one that does not have the right of free speech.
We have another question.
My question is mostly directed to the speaker on the left, although all the speakers can participate. I think we can easily fall into traps where we'll say, well, this person is, suppressing what is true, and I know what is true, where that necessarily, that can be wrong, and truth is something we have to dig for and have a lot of effort to find. When we're kind of designing a study in an academic way, what is an effective way for us to address not only the biases in the people outside of ourselves, but also inside of us, so that we do not fall into the same kind of traps where we believe what we already believe, are just trying to find data to support it? Thank you.
How do we get out of that? Well, I mean, I'm not as naive as I once was, but there were once standards that I could recognize that were sound methodological practices. And I review papers. I'm a referee, and I try to be dispassionate, but I know about what particular statistical techniques work with what particular type of data and what sort of methodology. So I don't think that there are not apolitical ways to make these judgments. Now, Grant, your other question, maybe I misunderstood it. Who's to say that I've got the truth? Well, I can tell you there is the two studies that I just told you about police and shooting people. There is no study in the world that points in the other direction. You just have critical theorists saying it's true. The police are mowing down. So at that point, you don't have to agree with that, but show me the evidence. And the other thing, let's say I am wrong. Then have a rip at me and tell me I'm wrong, right? If I get through a review process that is never going to be apolitical, but if I get through a review process and I'm wrong, then as Mark says, show me how I'm wrong. Show me other evidence. So I don't know if you were saying that, we may be passionate, but we may not be right. Well, there's ways to be more right or less right. And when I say to you that there has been great effort in trying to find evidence of racial bias in the police, and it's not been found, at least at that level, the only evidence goes the other way, well, then that's not the end of the story. Maybe the police are doing terrible things, but show me the meat, right? Show me the evidence of that. And it goes beyond, this is, for African Americans, for African Canadians, this is harmful to them because, if you're a 17 or 18-year-old kid and you think the cops are out to get you, you're going to interact with the cops accordingly. And so this is not even justice. This is terrible stuff. But remember all the things that are said about the police, and the police can do lots of things wrong. But you have to say, are they wrong? Number two, are they wrong on the basis of race, or are they just wrong? Right? But with this diversity, inclusion, and equity thing, the evidence that's used are differential outcomes. So when it comes to, for example, street checks, the only evidence there is to support racial prejudice in police checks is disproportionate numbers. Those numbers are real. But then you have to say, you have to make attributions about why those numbers exist. And, you know, there's debates to be had here. And there were debates. Back in the 1990s, there were debates about this. But now there's no debate. And why chiefs of police roll over and suck this stuff up is beyond me, but it's because we're all trapped in this. Does that kind of get to your question? I mean, you know, maybe I'm wrong. But if I'm wrong, show me I'm wrong. Don't censor, don't stop me from getting what I have to say out there.
Again, it's a matter of fear.
Now,
People are scared to put the truth out.
now I have a question for you. So you've invited people who disagree with you to take a rip at you, but how would I know that I'm safe to criticize you, that you won't retaliate against me?
Well, Mark's got again, so maybe I went too far with Mark saying he was optimistic. But Mark does lay out a good argument about how we should do this, bash this stuff around. I don't think people were ever good at being criticized. I think that probably in a previous time, we agreed it was necessary for the academic enterprise to work. So you try to work at being able to take criticism. But it's one of those things that we have to lay down as in a way that whether we like it or not, it's for the greater good. Now, why would I not come back at you as a professor? It's hard to say. I mean,
How can I trust you?
How
that
can you
won't?
trust me? Well, I mean, you do have policies in places so that I can't at least openly go after you or punish you. Because, you know, I've got power, I've got grading power, I know those arguments. But I just, well, I don't know what to say, because I think if you're a student and you kind of break some of these woke rules, you can be punished by your professor. So I don't know what to say, other than I wouldn't do that.
In the same vein, do you remember Francis Fukuyama?
Yeah.
Some of you will, but some
Yeah.
others won't. You know, he wrote The End of History and got that kind of wrong.
He gets everything wrong, but he's a very clear writer. very
But I remember
interesting.
reading a book by him called The Great Disruption, and one of the things that he said that we are beginning to lose is something he called social capital. And he described social capital as two things, really: trust and reciprocity. In other words, you have, you know, when people trust that the people they are encountering will sort of, I mean, what is reciprocity? It's kind of the golden rule of do unto others what, you know, you would have them do unto you, in a sense. And he said, you know, societies that sort of master that or come close to that are generally very prosperous, well-ordered, etc. Societies who don't suffer, and I think I remember him describing, I always remember a situation in Italy, what's the island out in Italy that all
Sicily?
Sicily.
Of course.
Sicily,
Sardinia.
yeah, Sicily, because I have a good friend who's from Sicily, and I always joke with him about being a mafia family.
He must love you.
Yeah, he loves me. Yeah, he does. Yeah. He agrees, actually. And Fukuyama said, you know, in the Sicilian situation, you take they'll take a family, they put the young boy on the wall and say, "Jump down, I'll catch you." And the boy jumps, and the father goes, boom. The kid just falls. He said, "See, never trust anybody."
Yeah.
And he says, and that's why Sicily is a basket case economically.
I think, Tanya, you can't actually trust anyone. You're just going to have to try it and you know, put your neck on the line. And that's unfortunate, but there is reputation, right? Some professors, some institutions have reputations for being places where people can engage each other critically without suffering penalties. Maybe fewer and fewer professors and institutions are gaining those reputations, but that would be something you look for. But is this a fear that you have? Does this occur often, that you don't
I'm thinking-
engage as you wish you could because you fear that the professor
Well,
would mark you down?
In my own experience, I found the people that I trusted, that I believed I could trust, hurt me very badly and took the opportunity to retaliate, even in underhanded ways. And so that was quite a frightening experience. And so I think that people who are more vulnerable, who have lower social status, might be very afraid to level criticism against those who have more power, because they can be subject to retaliation. And I think your answer is that you have an honor code, and I think the people who are worthy of power are competent and ethical and caring, and you've shown me those things, but there are many people in power who are not that way, and there's a hard way to learn that.
Okay, yeah. No, I wouldn't want the honor code. What I want is commitment to the academic endeavor. So if we're there because we want to engage in this particular project, then because we see trying to hurt people for criticizing us cuts against that project, then we're not going to, doing that isn't going to even occur to us. But on the other hand, if I think this is the distinction between a constraint that we place on ourselves as a side constraint, as opposed to those things we do where we look like we're constraining ourselves, but we're not. We're actually in some sort of project. So, for instance, civility. If you're at a shopping mall, there's no common project. People are at the shopping mall for all sorts of different reasons, and so we constrain our behavior quite consciously to be civil, because we don't want to get into trouble. We don't want to, and maybe we like some, other people and the rest. But why are we're not actually civil when we're engaged in an academic endeavor. We're not uncivil. Our behavior mirrors civility, but not because we're committed to civility, but because we're committed to the academic endeavor. Right? And so we have an institution where people are committed to engaging intellectually the problem at hand. They're not going to be verbally abusing each other, because that gets in the way of the project. It's not that they refrain from doing it because they think it would be impolite.
I'm going to turn the question back to Tanya, because
yes.
I think undergraduates would see very little difference, I expect, in the power I have from the power you have when you're teaching. Can your students trust you?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I have my teaching assistant do the grading, so I wash my hands of that.
No, you don't. Your teaching assistant advises you on the grades. You're still doing the grading.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're the professor. You
Yes,
do the grading.
I think that they
You take
can,
the advice from them.
but again, that's a matter of honor.
Yeah, and just probably to, from the point of view of press, you just got to sort of try to maintain a sort of civil arrangement. I remember, friends of my wife's, we visited in England. He would sit down every morning and read the Daily Mail while she read the Independent, which is, practically the equivalent between reading the Daily Mail and the Toronto Star or something of that notion. And they remained married for 40 years. So you can disagree. There was a great story. I shouldn't pick on our Prime Minister, but there was, I thought, one of the kind of a cute juxtaposition in press story that just came out over the weekend. Some of you may have seen a video that Prime Minister Trudeau decided to honor the Queen by going to the bar in the hotel and singing Bohemian Rhapsody or Freddie Mercury tunes. And the Daily Mail headline was, "Drunk Canadian PM Trudeau is slammed as a tone-deaf embarrassment for singing Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody at London Hotel before Elizabeth II's state funeral." But the Toronto Star headline was, "Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's impromptu tribute to the Queen included a hotel piano and Bohemian Rhapsody." So it's good to see that there's still room for disagreement among civilized people.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, gentlemen. It is now 8:30, so any further questions will have to be over beer at the Henry House. But could you please join me in giving a round of applause? Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And bringing your questions.